Hey guys, hopefully your evening is going well. I didn't even get a chance to say that we, of course, were going to have school tomorrow before our school got canceled. And so we are officially out for tomorrow. Um, our schedule is messy to say the least. And the reason why I say that is because of the fact that we do still have to stay on a time frame. And so, for you guys, first of all, just an FYI, you will be getting a message tomorrow from me about World War II. We do need to cover that material this week. But what is unfortunately going to be happening is you've got a test now on Thursday on chapters 30 through 32. Friday, we'll be dealing with a little bit of World War II, and then we'll need to test early next week. Your presidential parties test is on hold for the time being. Content comes first, and so for you guys, it would be smart to be working on getting those presidential parties down. But I do not have a definitive date because if anything can be pushed back, that can be pushed back the easiest. For you guys also, please, hopefully you got a message from me about a survey that I would like you guys to fill out about before and after school review sessions. We'd like to get those started early next week. Sometime next week. But figure out what days work, especially if you're an athlete. We meet before school and after school. Each review session is identical. And so choose which one fits their schedule the best, and we should be good. So for you guys, we'll do our review session tonight. You'll be able to ask questions tomorrow, but I would use your time off tomorrow on top of reviewing to start working your way into Chapter 33 with World War II. And again, my apologies. This is the most cold or winter days that we've had off in my entire teaching career, and it's very much not advantageous for you to be having this for AP US history purposes, but hopefully for your relaxation purposes, things are good. So we're going to be starting off with questions from period 2, and as usual, I'll run through all the time periods and make sure that we're good. So Evan's got a number of questions, and we'll be able to answer each of them. And by the way, thanks for being considerate with being worried about the number of questions you're asking, but you're absolutely fine. First of all, there's a question posed about the difference between modernism and fundamentalism. Modernism, well, let me start with fundamentalism. A fundamentalist is a Christian individual who believes very strictly in their faith. And that's in American terms. So if you talk about a fundamentalist, you could have a fundamentalist Muslim, a fundamentalist Jew. In this case, a fundamentalist Christian in the United States is going to be somebody who's very strict with their faith. They're going to literally interpret the word of the Bible to be the word of God, and they're going to argue that you cannot really, interpret what's going on with the words themselves. Whatever it says in the Bible is literally what is true. Modernism is a little bit more of a loaded term, though, and we're going to find that in the 1920s, modernism can take on a number of different forms. It can be a reflection on new art forms, especially when we think about like painters. Painters go off in a modernist direction because of the fact that they don't need to be photorealistic with their artwork anymore. We'll find modernism movements happening in literature and other trends. But in this case, the balance between fundamentalists and modernists, a modernist would be somebody who is more moderate about their religious faith. And in particular, they are more willing to embrace new scientific ideas that might challenge a fundamentalist view in the universe. I'm thinking like Charles Darwin and other sorts of things that might back up the ideas of evolution or other sorts of controversial topics for a fundamentalist. So that's the battle that they're examining during this time period. And you'll notice that battle leads to things like prohibition, like a backlash against progressivism and the concerns that you see happening in the 1920s. The next bullet point is asking about the lost generation. That is a group of authors that you have during this time period. F. Scott Fitzgerald is one of them. Ernest Hemingway is another. And these individuals are so turned off by what happened during the World War I time period that they feel that there's a failing of progressivism to accomplish the goals that they wanted it to, not for a failure of effort, but instead through all the attempts to try to make the society better, we've now ended up instead with a war that is going to lead to a second world war, and everybody can see it with the Treaty of Versailles. You've got a society that instead of moving in a more progressive direction, they have now moved in a conservative direction with an emphasis on prohibition. And it's obvious that the reforms of the early 1900s aren't necessarily the trajectory that we're going to be on for good. And so for many people in the lost generation, they become citizens of both America and Europe, and they don't feel really comfortable in either place because they feel like an opportunity has been missed. And so when you read the books of those individuals, they are very much realists who will write you stories that are, instead of being like good guys versus bad guys, you end up with a book like The Great Gatsby where everything is kind of gray and none of the characters are really good guys. But they could certainly be found in real life society, given the fact that they are gray in their morality. The third thing that you have here is the Harlem Renaissance, and the Harlem Renaissance simply is the congregation of a lot of African Americans in Harlem in New York. And they are living there because of racial segregation in housing. And so this is a black neighborhood that, instead of becoming a ghetto and run down because of the backlash that's happening with like the Red Summer of Hate in 1919, where you have race riots that are taking place, and where you have like some communities really struggling because of layoffs and whatever. This African American community is going to start exploring African American culture. They will have individuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, who are in Harlem, who are pursuing civil rights and advancing the idea that African American culture is worthwhile and relevant, and in Marcus Garvey's case, superior to the white society that's demonstrated that they are engaging in racism no matter what African Americans end up doing. You have jazz that's flourishing in Harlem. You've got poets like Langston Hughes, who we heard in class. And so that's going to be a movement where, with the Harlem Renaissance, the flourishing of jazz and artwork and whatever is going to then lead to an appreciation of African American culture. It becomes mainstream in white society as well. But then also civil rights leaders in the NAACP will find their footing in the Harlem, and then that will allow them to start pushing for a more and more powerful civil rights movement, especially when we emerge from World War II. I see a couple tariffs here. So the Fordney-McCumber tariff is a heightened tariff during the 1920s that's meant to reverse the changes that took place with the Underwood tariff. The Hawley-Smoot tariff is going to be the most infamous of the tariffs that you have in your textbook, and it's going to be really the moment up until recently when we realized that high tariffs are not the best way to be looking at trying to protect the United States. So with the Hawley-Smoot tariff, it's going to increase our tariff to very high levels, and this is going to take place in 1930, a year after the Great Depression starts, with the idea that if we can build a super high tariff, it can protect our companies from foreign competition, and it'll keep our companies safe. What it didn't pay attention to, though, is that our companies didn't need safety from competition. England was still not recovered from World War I, same with France. We're going to have Germany that is still struggling to get back on its feet. And so at that point, we really needed free trade, because once we set up these tariffs, we're not going to be able to sell stuff to Europe. They can't sell stuff here, and the entire world economy ends up grinding to a halt as a result. The next question is about the 4, 5, and 9 treaties. And so when we think about those treaties, they're listed in the wrong order there, but it's not really all that consequential. You have the 5, 4, and 9 power treaties. And Kirsten, I saw your question that coming up later. This is also known as the Washington Naval Disarmament Conference. So what's happening is you've got countries like England and America and Japan that are in an arms race to build their navies rapidly, like Alfred Mahan had mentioned in the late 1800s. America didn't want to maintain an arms race for their navy, and so they signed off to these power treaties, starting with the 5 power treaties. And the countries that are really important to notice are England, America, and Japan. In that treaty, they're going to set up a ratio of battleships that are going to be permitted for building. So this is going to limit the building of battleships and aircraft carriers. And the ratio is going to be this: for every 5 tons of battleships and aircraft carriers America builds, England gets build the same amount, and Japan gets to build 3 tons for every 5 that America is building. The reason why is because Japan only has one ocean that they are concerned about, with the Pacific, while America and England are trying to maintain imperial empires that are built across the planet. Following that is the 4 power and the 9 power treaties. The 4-power and the 9-power treaties are all dealing with the idea that in the Pacific we are going to respect each other's territorial interests. And then the 9-power treaty is also weaving into it an acknowledgement that we're going to respect China and the open door policy. The problem is once we sign the 4-power treaty and the 9-power treaty, Japan is going to drop out of those treaties, but America is still going to honor them. So they're still going to keep their navy small. But in the 1930s, Japan is getting the message from America that we don't want to fight in a war. And if we go to a war, we want to fight on paper instead of actually fighting militarily. And we're not ramping up our military the way that we should to deal with the threat from Japan that is becoming more imperialistic. So with those treaties, they're going to lull America into a false sense of security. And in the early 1930s, Japan is then going to do things like attacking places in Manchuria and attacking China. And they're checking to see, will America actually step up and fight? Because the Great Depression is so damaging for them that there's a feeling in Japan that they won't step up and actually fight in any wars because they are weakened by the Depression itself. Let me see here. The next bullet point is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Very simply, you had France and the United States that were negotiating, and France had a negotiator named Briand who was speaking to our Secretary of State Kellogg, and the argument was that we should set up an alliance between France and the United States with the purpose that if either two countries got attacked, the other country would jump in on their side. For Republicans who had just rejected the Treaty of Versailles for precisely this alliance system, this is exactly what they were worried about. They didn't want anything to do with this. They thought it violated George Washington's advice to stay out of European entanglements. And so with the Kellogg-Briand Act, what Kellogg is going to do is he's going to say, why don't we make this a treaty that makes all wars illegal? And instead of just France and America signing, let's get every country in the world to sign off on this treaty, which they do. And this is another part of that false hope that America has, where they're going to become isolationist, pull back from Europe with the idea that they have now outlawed war with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and that they have prevented war because of reducing the size of people's navies. During the Harding, Coolidge, Hoover presidencies, a lot of Republicans will argue we can then shrink our military and shrink the government because of the fact that we now no longer have foreign issues. And even if we do, we've got the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans that have always protected us, and they'll continue to do so. The next question that I see here is about the Hatch Act, and I saw in each of the class periods this was a law that was confusing. And so the way to picture the Hatch Act is I want you to think about like the spoil system you learned about previously. So if we think about the Hatch Act, imagine that we've got FDR, and FDR is creating all of these government programs that are giving out an awful lot of money, and imagine that he's got somebody working inside of one of his cabinet departments, and that person is overseeing a lot of money and helping out with a lot of jobs. The fear that was going on during this time period is that this person now who is controlling all the money of the New Deal is somebody who could be very influential either positively or negatively in elections, especially given the fact that they could be giving out graft or spoils. They could be used in their influence to help out elections. So simply put, the Hatch Act creates a bunch of different rules for individuals who are inside the government that prohibit them from getting directly involved in elections, especially the elections that will help re-elect the person that they're working for. So many of the people in the government who now have government jobs because of the Great Depression aren't allowed to then go out and campaign for FDR, especially for fear that they might also then start using their office as a way to help swing the election for him when they're supposed to be looking out for all Americans. So that's what the Hatch Act is getting into. It's a one-trick pony. It shows up fairly rarely throughout the rest of the course. There are people who have pointed out that recently in the Trump administration, there are people who have been accused of violating the Hatch Act. If you want to look at modern news, just Google search Trump and Hatch Act and you'll see it popping up there. But even when that took place, a lot of Americans are so unaware of this law that it really hasn't created much of a ripple for most of the people who have heard about that popping up in the news. Next bullet point is about the CIO. So when you think about the AFL, imagine that you've got a union that is gigantic and moderate, and it's able to survive crashes and the Red Scare because they are seen as just wanting bread and butter issues to be dealt with inside their union. There's a group inside the AFL, though, that's going to call themselves the CIO, where they would prefer that the AFL becomes much more aggressive in their negotiations, in their tactics. They want to use like sit-down strikes and other sorts of protests, especially since now they're protected by Franklin Roosevelt. And eventually this group is going to split and create a brand new party called brand new union called the CIO that is going to be the more aggressive of the labor unions that are now showing up on the scene, while the AFL will still be the more moderate of these labor unions. Because of FDR's protections, especially with the Wagner Act, the CIO doesn't get crushed like the industrial workers of the world were during the early 1900s. And then eventually what's going to happen is they're going to re-merge. So if you do ever end up getting a union job working in like a factory or a grocery store or whatever, you may end up joining a group called the AFL-CIO because they're going to merge together and become one group again after World War II is done. Your next person that you have listed in your bullet points is 3 individuals who are more radical than Franklin Roosevelt, and their ideas are going to be varying as far as the amount of acceptance they get. So let's start off with the most moderate and work our way to the most extreme. So you've got Francis Townsend listing here. His idea is to give old people $200 each month with the idea that if they get that money, they must spend it before they're able to get another $200 to spend the next month. The idea that Townsend has is that there's no incentive for old people to save this money because they are already at that age where they really need to spend the money that they have, especially since many of them are desperately poor. They need food, they need medicine, and if they are not allowed to save the money and they spend it, it will create a stimulus, and that's what you want to be looking for with Franklin Roosevelt. That understanding of Keynesian economics that I finished my video lecture with is crucial to understand the fact that there are people who believe that the government should start spending money if private citizens aren't, so that we can get the economy moving again by creating demand. So this is demand-style side economics that you see happening here. Townsend's ideas are the least radical of the 3, although they are quite different than what's been advocated in the past. These ideas will eventually become Social Security. The next person that you have is Father Charles Coughlin. Father Charles Coughlin had a famous radio show during this time period, but he started dabbling in politics, and his views were bordering on the ideas of fascism, where he was floating around the idea that we should, first of all, start giving money to all Americans so that they have enough cash to spend. But they also had these crazy conspiracies about how Jewish people were controlling the world economy and our banks. And so as a result, he argued that we should take banks away from Jewish people, nationalizing the banking system and making them part of the United States government, which borders on socialism. But then his ideas of anti-Semitism very much align with Adolf Hitler's, who was already risen to power in 1933. So fortunately, Father Charles Coughlin is going to end up going to the wayside because people are going to feel that his views are too extreme. Then finally, with Huey Long, he is a guy who believes in creating a extreme wealth tax, where he's going to argue that if you make more than $1 million, for each million above 1 million, you're going to be paying in different brackets. So between 1 and 2 million, you'll be paying a 1% tax on that income. Between 2 and 3 million, you'll be paying a 2% tax. And then you double those percentages to 4, 8, 16, 32, until eventually you get to about 12 million. And he's talking about 100% income tax on any money over $12 million. So he can buy everybody in America a house, a car, and a radio to listen to Huey Long's great ideas. This is by far the most radical of the ideas. He calls this his Share Our Wealth plan. It is very much akin to communism, but because it's being couched as populism, that he is a strong man who is protecting America's values by taking on the rich and helping out the poor, it's becoming palatable to people in America. So for Franklin Roosevelt, he argued that Huey Long was our most dangerous American during this time period for the survival of capitalism. Huey Long was mowed down by an assassin before the election in 1936, so there's no telling how well he would have done if he would have made it to the general election, but he had a huge following before he passed away. The question that I see next is asking about 4 works programs: CCC, CWA, PWA, and WPA, and what differences are there. And their differences are timing and focus. So let me start off with the first one. The first program is going to be the CCC, taking kids your age, moving them to places like the North Woods to build trails and cabins and whatever, and then sending a portion of those paychecks home to family members. That is going to be the earliest of those works programs. But then you'll find that the CWA and the PWA come shortly afterwards. CWA and PWA, unlike the CCC is happening in conservation areas, wild areas. So when you think about conservation like Teddy Roosevelt, those are places that would be like parks, national parks or the like. CWA and PWA is happening in urban areas. Let's build roads and buildings, police stations, and so on. And each of those two programs are created because the first one could be expanded, but rather than just adding on to it, FDR is creating another program that's slightly different, with the fear that these programs might be ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So if the Supreme Court rules the CWA unconstitutional, maybe the PWA floats through because it's not part of the lawsuit that's in front of the Supreme Court. The WPA, though, is the biggest of all these programs. It comes after those first three programs are in effect, and essentially it's FDR trying to figure out ways to employ as many people as possible doing whatever they're skilled at, with the idea that the work is less important than getting them money to help stimulate the economy, and not giving them handouts because that would then take away their work ethic. The thing you should notice for similarities, though, all of these programs are meant to be temporary. So the idea is you give people work at very low pay so that they're not starving and they're able to start saving a little bit. But then hopefully once they start spending their cash, it will create a stimulus for businesses. Businesses will start hiring people, and then they'll hopefully start hiring people at wages that are far higher than these works programs. So these programs are very much relief and recovery, CCC, WPA, PWA, CWA, and they're meant to be temporary. So when the economy turns and gets better, these projects will just stop wherever they are in the process, and they'll have served their purpose by helping people get through this tough time without having to depend strictly on just begging for money, which is what FDR does not want to have. The last bullet point asks the question, why the court ruled against the AAA and the NRA. With these two programs, it was ruled that the United States government was getting involved in business that was not strictly interstate trade. When it came to the AAA telling farmers how they can grow stuff on their farms, or the NRA telling people how they can run their individual businesses, even if those businesses aren't currently involved in trade between states, the Supreme Court argued in a very narrow interpretation of the Constitution that this was a violation of the federal government's powers, that those are states' rights rather than federal powers. When we create a second AAA, though, it's meant to overcome the objections that the Supreme Court had by figuring out ways to play within the bounds of the Constitution. But also, the second AAA was created when the Supreme Court shifted to a more liberal group, when FDR started to have justices leaving the court, and then he was able to replace them with people who are more liberal. Let me see here. Lastly, will be expected to know the act strictly by the abbreviations, or will written out names be included? I plan on having the written out names included. I don't want to have this be a trivia quiz. You're off tomorrow?
Yes.
Oh, my boy is off from school tomorrow too. We get to hang out and play video games. This is awesome. So will the programs be listed by abbreviations or written out? They'll be more given in context. So I believe the way the test is written is it'll have the name of the program and the abbreviation with it. But I'm not certain off the top of my head. I don't plan on doing a lot of like really nitpicky, trivial sorts of things. I'm looking more big picture at what the programs are up to. I see another question. What was going on with the Muscle Shoals bill? If you take a look inside your textbook, I should have gotten my textbook ready for this. Sorry about that, guys. Give me just 1 second. Muscle Shoals is an area inside the Tennessee Valley area. And so when you take a look at the Muscle Shoals project, Muscle Shoals was a project that was pitched to Herbert Hoover. Okay. So if you take a look at this map that's over here, you will find that at the very tail end over in, this area right here, you'll find Muscle Shoals. So it's a location that's along the Tennessee River. The Muscle Shoals project then was meant to be the works project that FDR turned into the TVA, but Herbert Hoover felt like that was way too involved. Building a dam using government money. He eventually would step up for Boulder Dam that became known as Hoover Dam. But in this area, he felt like it was going too far. For Franklin Roosevelt, he does not. And so you can see the difference between Hoover and FDR, where FDR doesn't just build the Muscle Shoals project, he turns it into the TVA, where he's building a series of dams through the Tennessee Valley, and he's now getting into the business of also providing electricity to customers. And so he is rapidly expanding past what Herbert Hoover was up to. And that's meant to show the contrast between the two of them as far as how they were viewing their goals for getting us out of the Depression. You've got FDR, who is not worried about the consequences of stretching the Constitution a bit. He's willing to use the elastic clause and the Commerce Clause in the Constitutions to do a wide variety of things. And in his mind, he is declaring war against the Great Depression, and so he feels like a lot of options are on the table because things are so bad. Sabrina, I see your question asking about the Dawes Plan. And the Dawes Plan very simply is this problem that you have right here. G is Germany, France is F, E is England. Germany owed reparations to France and England after the war was done. So the Treaty of Versailles actually stipulated that the Germans had to take blame for World War I taking place, and that the Germans had to then figure out how to repay England and France for all the debts that they accrued while fighting the war. So Germany has to repay the money that they spent, and then they also have to repay the English and French for the money that they spent. Now, the problem with doing that is a couple different things. First of all, Germany didn't start World War I, but they're forced to accept the blame for that. So this is where Adolf Hitler's rage is coming from when it comes to World War II. Secondarily, Germany is already broke at the end of World War I, and telling them they need to get money to repay the debts from the war is ridiculous. So what's going to happen is Germany is going to be forced to repay reparations, and what they're going to do is they're just going to turn on their printing presses. So during this period, Germany is going to be printing off so much money, it creates hyperinflation. And this is the reason why we get worried about too much inflation inside of our country, because Germany wrecks its money supply. It takes a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread from the baker. But Germany is being forced to repay its debts to England and France, and they're doing so with really crummy money. And the problem was, during World War I, England and France lent money to the United States, borrowed money from the United States, and they're now trying to repay it. But they're trying to repay it with this crappy German money that doesn't mean anything. So what the Dawes Plan is going to do is bankers during the 1920s are going to send loans to Germany. Germany is then going to use that American money to repay England and France, and then England and France is going to pay the United States. This on the surface seems like a really great idea because now all the European powers owe us money. The dilemma that we're going to have is during the same time period, we're going to be putting up a gigantic tariff around the United States. And so England and France, their economy is ruined. Germany's economy is ruined. They're asking, all of them are asking us, can we please just slow down the debt payments that are due? Because we don't have any cash and the economies are struggling. And America said, you guys are deadbeats. You need to pay us back our money. And then when that doesn't work out, the Dawes Plan starts lending the money. So Germany, England, and France all owe us cash. The plan that we don't anticipate, though, is the idea that Germany is going to stop repaying the United States. Especially when Hitler becomes the leader in 1933, they just ignore the fact that they owe us money. We anticipated that England and France would be the ones standing up to Germany, but England and France have been devastated by the Great Depression, and so they can't really stand up to the Germans. And we didn't get into the League of Nations, and so we can't really stand up to the Germans, and that's where World War II is going to come from. So that's what the Dawes Plan is in simplest terms. It looks like period 2's questions are done, but I will double back at the end to see if I've got any more there. Anna's asking about the sick chicken case. That's Schechter versus the United States, and that is simply put what torpedoes the National Industrial Recovery Act and the NRA portion of that law, where you've got people who are on farms where the United States government is going to start sending out specifications about what poultry can and cannot be sold at market. And there's going to be an argument that the United States government doesn't have any reason or power to be involved in telling you how you run your chicken farm or how you handle stuff inside your business if you're not involved in interstate trade. Now, the NIRA was creating codes for businesses and rules that they were supposed to abide by voluntarily. And then if they did, they would be able to put the Blue Eagle in their sign and get aid from the United States in planning how to get through the Great Depression. But this court case is going to undermine a huge chunk of that program, where it's going to argue that even doing that little bit was unconstitutional. And so this is very much FDR's plans to do a Hoover-style solution for the Great Depression, and still running into problems with the conservative Supreme Court that didn't like that idea. Let me see here. Sam, I see your question about the Teapot Dome scandal. Simply put, this is during the Harding presidency, where he put some people in positions of power who are more interested in spoils rather than doing the fundamental job for the American people that they're put in charge of. So our Secretary of the Interior during the Harding presidency, Albert Fall, is going to receive bribes from oil companies, and the bribes are going to be so that Albert Fall will then turn over control of land that is holding oil reserves for the United States Navy. So we've got oil in the ground that's set aside in case our Navy might need it during a war, but secretly these oil companies are stealing this oil from the United States government, and Albert Fall's allowing that to happen because of bribes that he's received. This is one of a number of different scandals during the Harding presidency that shows you we are now back to a more corrupt time period inside the federal government, like we saw in the late 1800s with the Gilded Age. Sam, the other question you have is about the Scopes trial, and this was the trial that happened in the state of Tennessee, where the state of Tennessee argued that it would be illegal to teach the ideas of evolution, and the only ideas that were permissible when it came to the beginnings of the universe was creationism, which would square with a more fundamentalist Christian viewpoint of the world. We had a teacher named John Scopes, who decided to take that case on, where he went into his school, started teaching evolution, got locked up, and then his trial became a celebrity trial where both the attorneys were incredibly famous. And in the court trial, John Scopes is going to be convicted and accused of teaching evolution, which he didn't deny. He was charged with a fine, but then that fine got wiped off later. But that's more inconsequential than the bigger thing that's being shown here. This kind of pulls back for you the idea of that battle between fundamentalism and modernism, like you had with the period 2 question from Evan, where it's very much exposing for you that we have individuals in our society who in the early 1900s are experiencing another great awakening, where we have some people who are feeling the country is changing too quickly, and they get very nervous about that, whether it's with the concerns about evolution or else making alcohol illegal. Some of them go to an extreme where you've got groups like the KKK engaging in nativism. And so you've got a battle taking place between people who are moving in different directions politically, and that becomes a hallmark of the 1920s. Let me see here. Kirsten, what was the Washington Disarmament Conference? Hopefully the discussion of the Powers Treaties is okay to explain what's going on with that. The McNary-Haugen bill is a bill that they just briefly alluded to in your 1920s documentary, where farmers were in trouble during the period right after World War I, where they were encouraged to buy tractors and start mass-producing food because we didn't know how much food we would need during World War I, and then World War I ended after 1 year. There was a feeling that by some legislators in farm states that the government should step in with some sort of populist-style solutions to help out the farmers who did the patriotic right thing by trying to provide food, and now they're in economic trouble. So the McNary-Haugen bill was saying that the government would then buy extra food that was created by the farmers, and then they would sell that over the course of the year to either developing countries or places that were experiencing famine or whatever, with the idea that it would just serve as a clearinghouse. So you pay the farmers so that they can keep paying their bills. Farmers are important because we desperately need food, and it would help them get through these tough times created after World War I was done. Calvin Coolidge, though, is going to veto this bill repeatedly, and he's going to argue that farmers have always been poor, and having the government step in and do something about that would be akin to socialism or communism, and it would make the farmers dependent on the United States government. So when you'll take a look at what Coolidge is up to, he will be pro-business in a number of different ways for factories, but farmers don't share that same spot in his heart that factories do. The next question, why did the Immigration Act of 1924 discriminate against the Eastern and Southern Europeans? We had waves of Eastern and Southern Europeans coming into America from 1890s on, and there was a feeling that they were culturally different. They were not as highly educated as previous waves of immigrants, so they were coming from situations of desperate poverty, very little education. Language differences were huge, unlike what we had early on with a lot of people coming from Northern and Western Europe. We've got a lot of people coming who are different religions, whether they are Catholic or Jewish. Many of them are coming with radical ideas that they're coming from places that didn't have functioning democracies, but they were very much eager about ideas like anarchism or socialism or communism. And so there's this feeling that the group coming into America was different and that they were ruining America. So as we discussed, the term nativism is what you want to use there, where you do have a very aggressive anti-immigrant feeling during this time period. And that's why they create a quota where they're going to only allow 2% of people to come in from certain immigration groups, and that's using the census of 1890 to artificially keep the number coming in low from Southern and Eastern Europe. Let me see here. Liberty loans. Liberty loans are loans that were given to the United States government during World War I. They are bonds, and they were repaid during the 1920s. The Agricultural Marketing Act that you're asking about is an extension of the Immigration Act of the McNary-Haugen bill, where the Agricultural Marketing Act is going to take place during the Great Depression, and what it's going to do is it's actually going to actively aid farmers in trying to market and sell their goods that have been overproduced during the time period. So where in the early 1920s McNary-Haugen can't get done, things are going to start happening to help out farmers because they are in such desperate shape with the crash in 1929, the deflation that comes along with it, and then the Dust Bowl is going to ruin things even more. It looks like you've got a question about the Hatch Act. Hopefully I've answered that well enough. Meg, I've got a question here where she's asking, what were the causes of the Great Depression? So, if I was going to run through a list of the different items that I would highlight for the causes of the Great Depression, there are some systematic issues that are going on, first of all. And so I would take a look at foreign issues, first of all, and I would like you to notice that England, France, and Germany are all economically weak, and what that's going to do is that's going to create a possibility of not just an American crash, but a global crash. And when we add tariffs into the mix, it's going to make free trade for those countries really hard. And so anything that we think about the crash in 1929, it's not just bad for the United States, it's bad worldwide. And when we take a look at people like Coughlin or Huey Long, they're appealing here in the United States, and we're not immune to those sorts of appeals, where over in Europe, we had the rise of a Hitler or a Mussolini. In Japan, we had Hirohito. In America, how you feel about FDR is totally your thing. But in my mind, he is much more moderate than Hitler, obviously. And with his liberalism, he is doing things to preserve rather than attack capitalism, although there may be many conservatives who would argue he went too far. He's not a Hitler. And that's what we want to notice with this crash, is Europe is desperately economically down, and they're willing to go down a path of fascism as a result of dealing with that. So when we think about what causes the crash, in my mind, it starts off with the stock market crash, especially because you guys were buying on margin, and then when you couldn't make your margin payments, the stock market is going to implode. Your biggest problem then is that banks are going to be affected by the stock market crash because they've been lending so heavily for people to buy on margin. That's not the only thing that's going on, though. When the markets start crashing, I've taught you about panics. And we experienced one. And sadly, Herbert Hoover is going to decide that instead of using the Federal Reserve to help back up the banks, he's going to argue that the banks need to suffer moral hazard and suffer the consequences of their bad lending. But what that means is we're going to implode the banking system in 1929 in a way that we don't need to. The Federal Reserve could pump money into the banks, keeping them alive. So even though the economic crash could happen, people would still have money in their pockets. It would require moving away from the gold standard and have more inflationary policies. Hoover's not interested in that, though. FDR will definitely do that with the bank holiday. We will then find a cycle taking place because factories are going to see a loss of investment happening because of the stock market crash. And when banks start having problems, that's the way that most people were buying stuff during the 1920s, is if they didn't have money, they'd be buying using installment plans or loans. And so what factories are going to start doing is when they start struggling, they'll either lay off workers or cut wages. And for workers, they're going to panic and they're going to start hoarding. So what happens is the factories are going to start laying off workers or cutting their wages, and they're going to start hoarding, which then has a negative impact on factories because they're losing buyers, and then eventually that cycle will grind the economy to the halt. You'll remember that Herbert Hoover's idea was, let's help out factory owners right here so we can help out with the people who supply products. But our problem during this time period is not underproduction, it's overproduction, especially when we factor in our farmers as well. They're producing so much stuff that they don't have enough buyers, and the people who are right here, they're not going to be stupid enough to buy like a toaster or a radio when they're not sure if they're going to have a job 6 months to a year from now. And so they're just going to stick with their old stuff, but as long as these guys aren't spending, these guys aren't hiring. So this is where FDR is going to come in with the idea that he needs to figure out ways to help stimulate the economy. How does he repair our banking system? How does he create works program to help out these individuals? How does he create an SEC to make this a safe place where you can invest, but not get into crazy schemes, or an AAA down here to help these individuals out? And then with factories, he tries out his NRA to try to figure out codes to help out the factories. But the factories aren't really in trouble because the factories are bad or the owners are out of cash. They actually need people to be spending to help turn the economy around, in FDR's eyes, and later in Keynesian economics ideas as well. When it comes to the cause of the stock market crash, though, Meg, it's really simple when you think about our stock market game. If you have your one investor right here, the stock market just goes up and down like we had during our Steel Empire game. The thing that's going to make that market go really out of control, though, is what we had with buying on margin. So imagine that we add in all these investors who have tons of money to spend on the stock market, and because they see the stocks going up, they're not just buying with their own money, they're buying on margin. They're going to create what we're going to call a bubble, and that bubble is going to really drive prices up really quickly, and it should scare everybody off because it's the same thing that caused our crashes back in the 1800s. This is an over-speculation bubble. So you've seen it in the 1830s and 1850s. We over-speculated on land. 1870s, 80s, 90s, we over-speculated on railroads. Here we're over-speculating on stocks. And the price will keep going up until somebody has a moment where they go, this seems really overinflated and not the right price. And as soon as that happens, the market's going to crash out. And as soon as this starts taking place, banks are going to stop letting people buy on margin, which means all that money that inflated the market is going to disappear instantaneously. And we're going to settle back to what the market should look like right here. But the problem is what the market should look like now feels like a severe crash because this is not where the economy has been for the past 5-6 years. And so this is where your stock market crash is coming from. You'll also learn when you get into 12th grade that there are ways to short the market, which means you can actually, when the stock market's crashing, gamble on the stock getting worse and make money off of it. And there are going to be some investors who figure out how to do that. So instead of working to slow down the crash or prevent it from happening, they're actually helping to accelerate it by getting this gambling spree to make the stock market crash worse. Samuel, what should we do with our New Deal charts since we don't have school tomorrow? I it's whatever. I will collect your New Deal charts on Thursday. There's no need to run through a snowdrift to submit these in the morning. Just enjoy your snow day when you come to class on Thursday. I'm going to be expecting your entire New Deal study chart, middle column and far right-hand column filled in. And on the far right, I'm going to want you to tell me that for programs like the AAA, that it'll say, I believe that this should be seen as a relief program because of these reasons. Or if you want to say, I believe it can be seen as relief and recovery because of these aspects. I'm looking for you to be specific with your analysis like you would be in an essay to practice that skill. Let me check to see with period 4 if I've got any other questions. Matthew, I see your question about Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics is simply put the idea that instead of just watching what the economy does and doing nothing, or doing supply side economics where all you're doing is helping out business owners, what you should be doing is this. When the economy starts crashing, John Maynard Keynes watched what went on with FDR, and his Keynesian economics after the Great Depression said that what FDR did wrong was not that he spent too much money, but that he spent too little. Now, if you talk to a conservative, the argument is going to be that they spent way too much and got government way too involved. But what Keynes is going to argue is this is precisely the reason why a government is in existence. When the economy goes bad, the federal government is the only institution that's allowed to raise debt or print money. Now, you've seen from Germany during this time period that that's dangerous if done wrong. But what Alexander Hamilton argued back at the start of our course is that debt could be seen as good if it was an investment. So what Keynes argued is during this time, this is when you cut taxes for everybody, because at this time, everybody could use every spare piece of money that they can get in their pockets. This is also the point where the government needs to become the stimulant for the economy. It needs to prime the pump. And so the government should create government programs to get money into people's hands that they will then spend to create demand inside of factories so that the factories will hopefully start hiring workers and producing yet again. So when we take a look at World War II next week, we're going to see it as the ultimate version of Keynesian economics, and it will fix the Great Depression, where the government starts massively spending for like tanks and planes and guns and whatever, and they're not worried about spending money that they have. They're going to issue war bonds and do all sorts of things with income taxes to get the money that they need, but they're going to be spending a lot of cash that they don't have going into debt in this precise case. Now, when the economy turns around, the feeling is then this is the point where you need to make some hard decisions because of the fact that when the economy gets better, this is when we should then do a correction. So according to Keynesian economics, liberals will get labeled as the group that wants high taxes constantly. A true liberal Keynesian economics philosopher is going to argue that when times get good, this is when we should increase taxes, but when things go bad, we shouldn't increase taxes. When the economy gets better, more people should be able to pay taxes without concerns, and so we collect taxes at that time. And if we ran a debt right here, this is where we fix that debt so that at the next economic crash, we then have no debt left over or very little so that we can then repeat the process and manage our way out of the economic crash. The other argument, though, is the idea that at this point we cut government spending because at this point we shouldn't need a lot of government programs if the economy is going well. You should be able to go out and get a job because of the fact that things are now going well. So this isn't a plan to make everybody dependent on the government. It's the idea that the government has certain financial tools that it can use to manage the economy and manipulate it. And what Keynes is thinking is if you imagine that the top is an A and the bottom is an E market from our Steel Empire game, he would love to keep our economy between B and D, where you have a little bit of a boom, but if it starts getting too hot and over speculating, we calm it down a bit with the Federal Reserve. And then if the economy starts going down, we don't crash it out. We figure out a way to manage that downturn so it corrects itself and then moves back up again. So for John Maynard Keynes and Keynesian economics, his philosophy will become the economic philosophy that we see a lot of people embracing following FDR, although it's come back into question now as we've got conservative challenges taking place to that. We'll take a look at those as we move into the 60s coming up in a few weeks. So let me see, I'm in period 6 right now. Hallie, I've got a question. Can I explain explain Andrew Mellon's belief in how taxes imposed burdens on the rich. So, if you remember the video that I showed you guys right before our now 5-day weekend, I showed you the idea that with a graduated income tax, they asked you to think about each spot on the brackets as being like a pocket. So, the lowest pocket had no tax attached to it. And then as you moved up to higher and higher brackets, you would then get to pockets that would be higher rates of taxation, especially during the period of World War I. For Andrew Mellon, though, he's going to argue that the government is not efficient. It's wasteful. He would highlight corruptions that you have read about inside your textbook, and you've seen it with like the Harding presidency, although Mellon would diminish that, but he would highlight instead graft going on with like political machines. And so his argument was you could make one of two different choices with money. You could take money away from rich people and give it to the government, and that's filled with people that have never produced money at that level before, and hope that they do good jobs with that investment. Or you could give that money back to the business owners and let them invest it in factories and businesses, and then those businesses will hire workers supplying them jobs and incomes, and then they will be able to pay taxes with that newfound job they have. So that's where Mellon is coming from as far as why he feels the way he does with cutting taxes for wealthy people. Can I explain how stock investments vanished on Black Tuesday? What's going to happen is companies' stocks are valuable because of the assets that a company has, and the faith that people have inside those companies. The problem, though, is that for many of these stocks, they're going to be overinflated in value as people just start buying them because they want to get involved in buying on margin. Many of these companies aren't all that valuable in the first place, but because people get irrationally exuberant about buying stocks, their price is going to go through the roof. When people start buying on margin, then they're going to need to find buyers for that stock when it's time to sell. So if we think about buying on margin, the idea is that you, at the number one point, buy low and sell high, and then you can make a profit. The dilemma, though, is what happens with the stock if nobody ends up buying it. And so what happened was, on the day that we're taking a look with Black Tuesday, we're going to have people buying stock right here at the number 2 point, and then the market is going to crash, and they're not going to be able to sell at their break point to be able to make back the money they owe the bank. It's going to crash too quickly. So many of those individuals will be bankrupted. They're going to have to start selling all of their stocks. And when everybody starts selling simultaneously and there's no buyers, the values of the stock just keep dropping and dropping until eventually, if there's no buyers for the stock and there's no interest in that stock, and let's say the company goes out of business because that was the way that they were funding themselves by getting investments from this money, those stocks can go from being valuable to being worthless, depending on what starts happening with the markets themselves. We're also going to see cash disappearing on this day, and one of the things that you guys will want to pay attention to when you move on to economics is you want to notice what's going on with velocity when we start talking about money. So if you think about the individual that you have right here, that person has a dollar bill, but the thing that you need to keep in mind is that dollar bill might have a life of its own when you think about it this way. Imagine that person with the dollar bill puts that dollar into the bank. That bank has now taken possession of that dollar bill and is counting it as theirs, but the person who deposited that dollar bill also claims that dollar is theirs. So on the official books for the United States, that one paper dollar bill is actually looking like a couple dollars. When that dollar is lent out to a person to buy a car and then they give it to the person at the dealership, that dollar has now shown up in 4 different places, even though it's supposed to be the property of this individual right here. In one form or fashion, it's now showing up in other parts of the economy. So you're going to find that when we crash the economy itself, one of the questions that kids will ask will be like, well, where did those dollar bills go? this dollar bill that that person originally had still physically exists. It now is owned by these guys. This guy right here, though, has a car that he traded for that dollar bill, and he owes that dollar bill to the bank, but he's never going to repay it during the Great Depression. And these guys are never going to give that dollar back to this guy, which means that there's money that evaporates on the day, even though the paper number of dollars stays the same. That velocity inside the market where dollars are moving is what then inflates the number of dollars that are on the books. If that's confusing, it's not going to be consequential for your U.S. history class, but if you were curious, that's where it's coming from. Hallie's got a question also. Is there a difference between the National Industrial Recovery Act and the National Recovery Administration? The National Industrial Recovery Act is the law that is creating the codes that are going to be enforced by the National Recovery Administration. So the National Recovery Administration is the group that's created to oversee the law that's been created with the NIRA. Let me see here. Brooke, can I go over the CIO and their relationship with the AFL? Hopefully I've explained that well enough earlier. The NRA is a group that is different than the National Rifle Association nowadays. They're the ones that I was describing earlier that are working with businesses and labor unions to try to create minimum wages, maximum work hours, and working codes that businesses would engage in. And it's very much like a Hoover supply side solution to the Great Depression, asking businesses to cooperate with government. We're going to find it undermined with two different things. Number one, a lot of businesses are going to argue that they can't do minimum wages during a time where the economy is imploding. And then also people start putting the blue eagle inside their storefronts and on their products to signify that they're with the NRA, but they're not actually doing what the NRA is trying to accomplish. So we're going to find that this is a failed effort on FDR's part to try to work in a supply side manner that Hoover endorsed. Let me see here. On page 721, the textbook refers to this new old guard. Kaylee, let me see what they're referring to here. I apologize that you're sitting here watching me read. I just want to make sure that I'm getting what's going on here. Oh, I get it. All right, so what they're referring to here is the Republicans, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, that you see moving into the presidency and dominating government. These individuals have the same mentality as the stalwarts of the late 1800s. And if you remember the stalwarts, they were the ones around the time of James Garfield's assassination who felt like reform was not what the Republican Party should be a part of. They should be the party of gold standard, laissez-faire economics, pro-business. Mugwumps and half-breeds were pushing against them for reform, and at this time we had progressives pushing against them as well with like Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. But this is a return to that old guard Republican mentality of the late 1800s Gilded Age. Let me see here. Brooke, why did the United States implement such a high tariff? If it was killing the worldwide trade economy. The United States was not worried about the global economy during this time period. And the reason why is because economics was still a very new field, and they hadn't really had the opportunity to see what global economic trends could do to the United States. So there was a feeling that our oceans would protect us not just militarily, but also they didn't really envision the idea that there could be a global Great Depression that could wipe everybody's economies out and could infect each other's economies kind of like a disease. So with isolationism, what they're going to do is they're going to try to wall off the United States economy so that they can then trade internally. But with the other measures that they took by like not using the Federal Reserve to save banks, and not doing enough to actually stimulate demand, we're going to see that that's a failed attempt to try to help bolster our economy. There's other things that could have been done with a high tariff that could have made things better, but there's a collaboration of things that went wrong. Let me see here. Brooke, what chapters are going to be tested next week? You have, coming up next week, and this is a great segue, you have two chapters that really should have been one. And we're going to teach them simultaneously when we're working our way through. Chapter 34 and 35 are both, let me see here. Actually, I will need to get back to you on that because I need to check my dates I assume that World War II was split. Oh no, here we go. Chapters 33 and 34 should be merged. They are two shorter chapters, one dealing with the path to the war and one dealing with the war itself. It should all just be one chapter. I'm going to be able to deal with it very simply with the stuff that we'll be doing, especially flipping it back to you guys. And so 33, 34, World War II, sadly we're going to have to deal with it mostly online. But we'll see how we do, especially on Friday with the time that we have. My goal is also to return your essays to you guys because you deserve to see what your writing has looked like. And it has been a bit, but we've also been away from each other quite a bit. Let me see here. Looks like period 6 is done. Period 4 is done. Period 2 is done as well. If you are one of my young drivers, be super careful when we're dealing with this stuff tomorrow. It's supposed to be a good amount of snow and warm enough to make it like slushy, melty, but also just nasty. So if you don't have to drive, please don't. I look forward to seeing you guys on Thursday. You definitely have my sympathy given the fact that this is not the ideal way to do AP US history. But I'm also at your fingertips. So if you guys need any sort of questions answered, feel free to email me. I'll be sitting around here at the house waiting for you guys to come back to school so we can hang out together again on Thursday. Enjoy your snow day, and thanks again for joining me tonight. See you guys a couple